Hey, Bright Suns, everybody. This is the episode of Board Game Cantina that we've been working on editing for a while. And in this episode, I want to get past all of the prep and shot corrections and things like that and get into some actual cutting of the footage. I spent years cutting other types of projects where I was not heavily using keyboard shortcuts, and boy, was it adding on to my time. So what I wanted to show in this tutorial is some of the most common cuts that I make for this show, and then what are the keyboard shortcuts that go with those cuts, and then also just some of the basic navigation around. Hopefully, if it even shaves a few seconds off for you here and there, and you're doing hours of editing, that can really add up. It's definitely done that for me. So it's just a couple of basics I wanted to familiarize you with, because I got surprisingly far into working with Adobe Premiere over the years without really buckling down and learning any of that stuff. And now I sort of regret that. I wish I would have learned some of it sooner. So here's a handful of things that I'll show you in this episode. One is, if you're brand new to Adobe Premiere and you just want to know, for starters, like, okay, how do I play back my footage? You can use these playback controls up here. You can play and stop. I'm using the space bar on my keyboard. Play,
One of my favorite ones.
pause. I'm zoomed in a little bit on the timeline. To zoom in and out, I'm just going to use the plus sign on my keyboard and the minus sign to zoom back out again. So eventually I can see the whole thing. This is the entire multi-camera sequence that we collapsed together from our 3 different camera angles in a previous episode. We actually worked on the gameplay portion, which had 4 different camera angles. This is kind of the post-game discussion where we're enjoying our cocktails, we're talking about the game and side topics. So there's no overhead view for this part. So there's only 3 different camera angles that we need to worry about switching between, but they are all represented in this single green multi-camera track. And as it's playing,
Which we ended up doing afterwards.
right now we're looking at camera 2, but if I just hit the 1 button on my keyboard, like the number 1,
It's because there's one.
it's going to switch to camera 1. There's a little bit of a delay because right now my computer is also trying to screen capture all of this for this tutorial. So it's a lot for it to crunch, but it's a little bit smoother when I'm not also doing that. Now, as it's playing, if I want to switch to camera 3 over on the other side of the table, I just hit the 3, and sure enough, there it is. So this whole editing process is really just going to be a matter of stepping through the footage and at any given moment trying to find the best, most appropriate, most interesting angle where we're seeing what we would probably instinctively want to see as the audience, and ideally hiding and covering up anything weird or awkward as best we can. With this group of people, that's hard to do. 100%, so we'll do our best. Another quick shortcut I wanted to show you is the up arrow on the keyboard will take you back to the beginning of whatever clip you have selected. And you'll notice this white outline around the clip is telling me that's the clip I have selected. If there were others in here after it, they would not have a white outline around it, and that would tell me which clip is going to respond to me hitting the up arrow. So the playhead jumps to the beginning of this clip when I hit the up arrow, and it's going to jump to the end of it when I hit the down arrow. So sometimes when you're zoomed, let me zoom back in again, you're zoomed way into the middle of it. Now you can't really see the forest for the trees anymore. You're like, where am I? I don't even know where I am in this show. I can scroll all around. If you just want to very quickly get all the way back out to the bird's eye view, hit the backslash key. It's near the top right of your keyboard, right underneath the backspace button. Immediately zooms you all the way out to where you can see the entire sequence all in one view. Even if there were other clips, you'd be able to see all of those. This is a good moment to mention this blue outline that you see around the timeline panel. That is telling me that if I'm hitting keyboard shortcuts, that's the panel that is going to respond to them. So for example, if I'm zooming in and out, it's zooming in and out of this timeline because that's the panel that's active right now. Whereas if what I needed to zoom in and out of was actually my keyframe timeline up here in my effect controls panel, I'd need to click up here so I'd have this blue outline around it. And then as I hit my plus and minus keys on my keyboard, that's what I'm zooming in and out of. A little bit hard to see because it's kind of crammed in there in this view of the workspace. It's easy to lose track of that even with a nice bright blue outline. I will sometimes trick myself into getting confused. So if you feel like you're hitting keyboard shortcuts and you're not seeing what you expect to see, just make sure that the panel you're actually trying to interact with is the active panel. So let me zoom back out again. Let's figure out the first cut we want to make. Finally, after so much preparation, we're ready to start cutting this footage. So I'm gonna zoom way in on the beginning of the footage. And what this process of zooming in does, that at least is helpful for me, is it lets me start to see some detail in the audio wave, which a lot of times is what I'm going off of when I'm deciding where exactly do I want to make the cut. If you notice this little bump right at the beginning,
All right.
It's probably not loud enough for you to hear on your end, but it's the tail end of Bridget saying, mm-hmm. And I think, right, I'd already cut off some preliminary footage of us sitting down and getting plugged in and so forth. And I had just asked Bridget and Aaron, are you guys ready? Like, are we ready to start filming? And they're both saying yes or mm-hmm. And I managed to not quite cut all of that off. So instead of playing and pausing with the spacebar, I'm going to use the left and right arrow buttons on my keyboard. And that lets me go an individual frame at a time. And so somewhere right after the end of her audio saying mm-hmm, in this empty space before I start giving my intro, is where I want to make my first cut. And I'm going to start by showing you how I used to do my cuts, which took a ridiculous number of clips. And then I'm going to show you the one button press that will do all of that for comparison, so you can see why I thought it was important to share some of this with you. So here's the kind of quote unquote old fashioned way of doing it. So I move my playhead to exactly where I want to make the cut. Now I need to switch the tool that I'm using, basically what mode is my mouse in right now, from the selection tool, which is this little normal mouse arrow looking tool, to the razor blade tool, which we would do our cutting with. So I click the razor blade button. Now, when I'm hovering over a clip, my mouse arrow turns into a little icon of a razor blade with a little dotted line. And the dotted line is showing me exactly where will the cut happen when I click the mouse. So I put it right where my playhead was, because that's where I decided I want the cut to happen. Click the mouse, and now my clip is split into two separate clips. If I switch back to the selection tool, now I could grab this later clip, drag it, move it around. I could delete it if I hit the delete key. Oh no, there goes all my footage. There goes the entire show. So I'll just hit the Control-Z keys on the keyboard to undo that. I can slide it back. In fact, I'll even just undo back to before I even made that cut. So here's another step I would normally need to do. Let's say I did make that cut. Now, that little moment of Bridget saying, mm-hmm, I just want that out of there like it never happened. So the next thing I need to do is click my selection tool, click the clip of her saying, mm-hmm, to highlight it. And then I could just hit the delete key on my keyboard, but notice now I have a big old empty space. And now what I need to do is grab this clip and back the train up so it takes up that empty space in between. That's some extra unnecessary clicks. I could right click on it. I could hit cut to delete it instead of hitting the delete key. But really what I want to do is what's called a ripple delete. And when I hit that, it not only deletes the clip that I didn't want, but it automatically moves everything after it earlier on the timeline to fill in the empty space. So ripple delete is definitely your friend. But given the fact that we have to do all of those things I just did in a row pretty constantly throughout this whole process, potentially for hours, depending on how much footage you have, it would be so nice to be able to just do it all with one keystroke. And in fact, you can. And that key is the Q. So all the way up in the top left corner of your keyboard, you've got a Q and a W, and they basically handle this sort of in opposite fashion from each other. So watch what happens. I put my playhead where I want it. Let's say it's somewhere right in here. I hit the Q, and what's going to happen is it's going to make a cut right where my playhead is. It's going to essentially trim the beginning of this clip all the way forward to where my playhead is, and then it's going to ripple delete the empty space and move all the footage that comes after it. Even if there were other clips besides this mega clip that's got everything in it, it would move everything forward to take up the empty space just by hitting the letter Q. And if I'm like, oh, you know what? I want to even trim off a little bit more of that empty space. Just put the playhead there. I can use my keys on my keyboard to go individual frame at a time if I want. Hit the Q again, it does it again. So it's really effortless. The opposite is true. Let's say we go to the end of the footage. Oh, in fact, I should be using my keyboard shortcuts. I'll hit the down arrow on my keyboard. That'll jump me right to the end of the clip. And then let's backtrack a little bit. And so we're sort of holding our look to camera so that I can edit in some sort of a transition out of here at the end of the show. Let's say, oh, that's goes on a little bit longer than it needs to. Let's trim everything from here to the end of this clip. And we do that by using the W key right next to the Q. So it's basically the opposite function from the Q. So Premiere has a lot of keyboard shortcuts that work in pairs like that because they're the same thing, maybe just in opposite directions. So that's why you'll see the C key, which turns your mouse into the razor blade, is right next to the V key, which will turn it back into the selection tool. So if you want to flip back and forth between those, it's easy to do. So I hit my up arrow key to transition back to the beginning of this clip. And now what we're going to do,
All right, we are back.
is we're going to look for the first moment where it would feel natural to transition from our master shot, which is actually where we should start. So I'm going to go back to camera 2. There we go.
All right, we are back.
And I'm going to look for the moment where we would want to cut to one of the side angles. Let's just listen for a second and see if we can hear a spot where it feels like that should happen. From the kitchen, we got our cocktails. This is the Blurg Fire.
And it's super good.
So there's this moment where Aaron's responding by saying that the Blurg Fire, which is our cocktail for this episode, is super good. So maybe that's a moment where what we want to do is cut to camera 1 and see him saying that, so we're looking at him a little bit more directly.
And it's super good.
And what I found I like to do is, instead of cutting right before they say whatever they're saying, which can feel a little bit like the edit is kind of telegraphing or anticipating what they're going to say, which has a slightly unnatural feel to it. I like to let them start to say it, and then right after they start to open their mouth or words start coming out, then I make the cut, almost like if there was a live switcher or producer in the room who was cutting between our cameras for us as we're filming. They would hear Aaron start to say that, and there'd be just a momentary lag where they're trying to keep up, and then they're hitting the button to switch to camera 1 in response to him starting to say that. To me, that feels a little bit more natural, so that's how I like to do it. But your mileage may vary.
Cocktails. This is the Blurg Fire.
Okay, so he's just starting to say it. You can even see the little audio bump here where his voice comes into the mix. And that's where I'll make my cut. So now in this case, I don't actually want to delete any footage. I just want to split this clip. So a good keyboard shortcut for that, so I don't have to come up here, hit the razor blade tool, make the cut. I could do that, but a little bit of a time saver if I just position the playhead where I want it, and then I'm going to hit Control K. That is my keyboard shortcut. Apologies, these are all Windows shortcuts. If you're a Mac user, there's corresponding shortcuts for all these. I just don't know them off the top of my head. It's usually going to be some variation of the Option key. We'll get you there. So I'm sorry if I can't be as knowledgeable about the Mac version of all of this.
Super good.
So now what we want to do is we want to be looking at camera 1 as he's saying it's super good. So notice, because the playhead is now over this next clip, that's the one that's got the white highlight on it. That means when I start to hit the number keys on my keyboard to change the camera angle that we're pulling out of this multi-camera sequence, that's the one we're going to be changing as opposed to the previous one. So I'm looking at the right clip. I'm going to hit the 1, and now we're switched to camera 1. And in fact, if I were to zoom out, the whole rest of this show is now looking at camera 1, unless I go in and make more edits, which is what I'm going to spend the next couple of hours doing here. So I'm not going to make you sit through and watch me do all that, but wanted to just show a couple of examples. So now we're looking at him saying it's super good.
Super good.
Are we liking it?
Yeah.
Delicious.
Yeah,
So that feels right.
I think this is one of my favorite ones so far.
Now it starts to immediately feel a little bit awkward to just linger on it.
You liking it?
Yeah.
Delicious.
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite.
So maybe like mid-sip, I'm going to cut to the opposite angle so that we're seeing Bridget's reaction to the cocktail. So let me insert another cut. So I'm hitting Control K now that the playhead is right at the moment where I want the cut to happen. There's my cut. And now see how the previous clip is still what's highlighted? So before I go hitting the button to change the camera angle, I just need to bump the playhead over so the next clip is highlighted, because that's the one I want to change. So now let's flip over to camera 3. So I'm just hitting the 3 on the keyboard.
So far.
And now we're just kind of picking up the second half of that sip as she starts to put her glass down. Now it's weird that my glass is perfectly covered up by my microphone. So that might actually be a moment where I want to cut back to the master. So let me insert one more cut and then flip the clip that comes after back to camera 2. Yep. Okay, so now let's just look at all those cuts in sequence and see if we like it.
Blurg Fire.
And it's super good.
Are we liking it?
It's
Yeah.
delicious.
Yeah, I think this is one of my favorite ones so far.
I think it has something to do with that kind of like savory rim.
So that's basically it in a nutshell. The whole rest of the process is really just me inching through it for the next couple of hours. This is about an hour and 15 minutes worth of footage, and there may be some stuff to chop out or not use. And then when this sequence is done being cut, then I'll go through and do the same thing for the gameplay. We have a lot of gameplay, probably a good hour and 45 minutes. So I'll cut that. I may post that to YouTube as an uninterrupted full gameplay episode. People want to be able to see that. But what I'm going to do is then just pull out the highlights or the most interesting parts where we really are kind of commenting on how we like the experience. what's unique about the game, and pull those into this actual episode of Board Game Cantina. And then I'll have a third sequence that is our kitchen sequence. That's where we're actually mixing up the blurred fire, and we got Aaron in on the act, so he's helping make that. And so there will be a fourth sequence that is the overall show that I can then pull these other 3 sequences into, intercut between, put my titles in, make any final tweaks I want to make, and then render all of that out. And then that kind of overall master sequence is what I'll be rendering from and posting to YouTube. And then hopefully I can find a couple of fun moments. I will reframe the resolution of the sequence to a vertical resolution and render out a couple of reels. If we find some fun things we want to use to kind of promote the episode, then we can post those to Instagram, YouTube Shorts, etc., to get a little bit of traffic on the episode. So hopefully this is helpful. Definitely let me know if you've got other patterns or best practices that are working well for you. I'm trying to stay in learning mode on this stuff. I've definitely learned a lot over the last couple of years, but I still feel like I'm barely scratching the surface of what there is to know about this. So let me know, and I look forward to talking to you soon. May the force be with you.